For centuries, the Alpha Council dictated every howl, every step, every breath. Their dominance seemed absolute, their traditions unbreakable. But deep within their ranks, a quiet force was stirring, an Omega, seemingly insignificant, yet harboring a power so profound, it would force a reckoning that no Alpha could have ever foreseen. Prepare to witness how quiet strength ignited an irreversible revolution. In the heart of the Crescent Valley, where ancient pines stretched toward the perpetual twilight and morning mist clung to the earth like forgotten memories, there existed a pack governed by traditions older than the trees themselves. Among them lived Sarah, an Omega who had mastered the art of becoming invisible while standing in plain sight. To the casual observer, Sarah was nothing remarkable. She moved through the communal spaces with her head slightly bowed, her steps silent on the forest floor, her voice rarely rising above a whisper during pack gatherings. She took the smallest portions at meals, occupied the coldest corner of the den during winter, and never once raised her eyes to meet the gaze of an Alpha. In a society that valued dominance displays and vocal assertions of strength, her quietude was interpreted as exactly what the hierarchy demanded of an Omega: complete submission, absolute insignificance. But before we dive in, I need to ask you something that truly matters to me. If you've enjoyed my stories before, or if you're here hoping this one will move you, please don't leave without subscribing. Without your subscription, YouTube buries everything I create. The people searching for stories that make them feel something, stories about resilience, love, impossible choices, they'll never find them. Because the algorithm decided I wasn't worth showing. I'm not asking for money. Just 30 seconds to hit that subscribe button so others can discover these stories too. I pour everything I have into every word, every character, every chapter. And knowing I could reach someone who desperately needs it but won't because you didn't click, that genuinely breaks my heart. Please subscribe. It costs you nothing, but to me, it means someone believes these stories matter. Now, let's continue. But those who truly understood the language of silence might have noticed the contradictions. They might have seen how conflicts seemed to resolve themselves shortly after Sarah passed through a room, how injured pack members recovered more quickly when she tended to them in her unobtrusive way, how the youngest pups instinctively sought her presence when frightened or lost. They might have wondered why, despite her lowly status, she was never bullied as harshly as other Omegas, as if some invisible barrier protected her from the worst of the pack's cruelty. The Alpha Council, however, noticed none of this. To them, Sarah was a shadow, a footnote in the grand narrative of pack politics, barely worthy of acknowledgement. They could not have imagined that this overlooked Omega carried within her a power so profound, so fundamentally different from their own understanding of strength, that it would one day bring their entire world crashing down around them. Her silence was not submission. It was patience. It was observation. It was the quiet gathering of storm clouds before lightning splits the sky. The Alpha Council of Crescent Valley consisted of 5 wolves whose combined authority had remained unquestioned for 3 generations. At their head sat Cain, the prime alpha, a massive silver-furred wolf whose very presence commanded obedience. Beside him sat Mara, whose strategic mind had crushed rebellions before they could even properly form. Then came Torvin, master of combat and enforcer of the council's decrees, Lysandra, keeper of traditions and ancient laws, and finally Demetrius, whose network of loyal subordinates ensured that every whisper of dissent reached the council's ears before it could spread. Their power structure was built on foundations laid down centuries ago, when the first alphas had carved out this territory and established the immutable laws that governed pack life. The hierarchy was sacred, they taught. Alphas led because they were strongest, most capable, most worthy. Betas served as their administrators and warriors. Mid-ranks filled necessary roles. And Omegas existed at the bottom, performing menial tasks, because nature herself had deemed them weakest and least valuable. To challenge this order was to challenge the natural law itself. Cain's grandfather had executed 3 wolves who dared suggest that rank could be earned rather than born. Cain's father had exiled an entire family for questioning whether the council's decisions truly served the pack's best interests. Cain himself had, in his youth, personally beaten a young beta who proposed that Omegas might be given slightly larger food portions during harsh winters. The message was clear and consistently reinforced. The council's word was law, their authority absolute, their wisdom unquestionable. Pack gatherings followed rigid protocols. Alphas spoke first, their voices carrying the weight of command. Betas could respond when acknowledged, their input valued but ultimately subordinate. Mid-ranks remained silent unless specifically addressed. And Omegas? Omegas did not speak at all during formal assemblies. They stood at the edges, heads bowed, existing merely as reminders of what one became when one lacked the strength to rise higher. The council's chambers occupied the highest cave in the territory, accessible only by a steep, treacherous path that itself served as a metaphor for their elevated status. Here, surrounded by the preserved pelts of their ancestors and the carved stones bearing ancient laws, the 5 alphas made every significant decision affecting the pack's 200 members. They decided who hunted and who stayed behind, who mated with whom to ensure the strongest bloodlines, who received medical attention first when illness struck, who ate from the fresh kill and who received scraps. Every aspect of pack life flowed from their authority, and for generations, none had successfully challenged them. Until now. But the council, secure in their power and surrounded by the trappings of tradition, remained blissfully unaware that the very foundations of their reign were beginning to crumble, eroded not by force or open rebellion, but by something far more insidious. The quiet, persistent influence of an Omega who understood that true power need not announce itself with fangs and fury. It began with small things, incidents so minor that individually they merited no attention whatsoever. A bitter territorial dispute between 2 mid-rank families, one that had threatened to escalate into violence and potentially split pack loyalties, simply evaporated. One day the families were at each other's throats, the next they were cooperating as if the conflict had never existed. When questioned, both parties seemed uncertain exactly how the resolution had occurred, mentioning only that they'd each gained new perspective on the situation. Sarah had been seen near both family dens in the days preceding the peace. The pack's food stores, carefully calculated by Mara to last precisely through winter, somehow stretched further than expected. No one could explain it, yet every member of the pack seemed slightly better fed than projected. The council conducted an investigation, suspecting theft from their personal reserves, but found no evidence of wrongdoing. Sarah had been working in the storage caves, organizing supplies in her assigned role as an Omega servant. A dangerous undercurrent of dissatisfaction among the younger betas, those who chafed under the council's most restrictive traditions, failed to coalesce into the rebellion that Demetrius's spies had warned was forming. Instead, the would-be rebels seemed to lose their anger, redirecting their energy into constructive projects that actually benefited the pack. They built better shelters, improved hunting techniques, created more efficient systems for caring for pups. Many of them had spent time around Sarah, who often worked in the background during various pack activities. Then there was the incident with the sickness. A respiratory illness swept through the pack one harsh February, the kind that typically killed the weakest members, the elderly, the very young, and, of course, the Omegas who received medical attention last. The council had grimly calculated acceptable losses, as they always did, prioritizing treatment for alphas and valuable betas. But this time, the sickness didn't follow the expected pattern. Omegas recovered at unusual rates. Elderly wolves who should have perished grew stronger instead of weaker. The illness seemed to lose its virulence days faster than natural. The council's appointed healer, a skilled beta named Rowan, was baffled. "I've done nothing different," he reported to Mara. "If anything, I had fewer herbs than usual due to the difficult winter. Yet the recovery rate is unprecedented." What Rowan didn't mention, because he himself hadn't consciously noticed, was that Sarah had been present in the healing den almost constantly during the outbreak. She'd positioned herself as merely an assistant, fetching water and changing bedding, but she'd spent hours beside each patient. Her hands gentle as she adjusted blankets and her voice soft as she murmured words of comfort that somehow seemed to reach even those deep in fevered dreams. The council, when presented with the positive outcome, simply attributed it to the pack's superior genetics and moved on. Alphas, in their view, did not waste time questioning favorable results. But Torvin, the combat master, began to feel uneasy. His position required him to be observant, to notice patterns in chaos. And a pattern was emerging, though he couldn't quite articulate it. Things that should be going wrong were going right. Tensions that should be building were dissipating. The pack was functioning more smoothly than it had in years, yet none of the council's policies had changed. "Have you noticed," he mentioned to Demetrius one evening, "that there's been almost no discipline required lately?" The younger wolves seemed calmer. Demetrius, whose role as information gatherer made him equally attentive to subtle shifts, nodded slowly. "I've noticed. My informants report fewer complaints, less grumbling, even though we've changed nothing about the restrictions that usually cause friction. It's almost as if someone is." Torvin trailed off, the thought too absurd to complete. "Managing things without authority to do so?" Demetrius finished. Both wolves fell silent, the implication too ridiculous to seriously entertain. Who could possibly influence the pack without the council's knowledge or permission? They were alphas. They controlled everything. Yet the unease remained, a splinter in Torvin's mind that he couldn't quite extract. The council's regular assembly in mid-March provided another curious incident. Kane was presenting a controversial new law that would further restrict Omega movements, confining them to even more limited areas of the territory. It was a decision calculated to reinforce hierarchy, to remind the lowest ranks of their place. As Kane spoke, his voice carrying the absolute certainty that characterized all council pronouncements, something strange happened. The assembled pack, rather than showing the usual mixture of approval from higher ranks and resigned acceptance from lower ones, seemed collectively uncomfortable. Not rebellious. There was no challenge in their postures, but something subtler. A shared hesitation, a collective sense that this particular law was wrong, even if none could articulate why. Kane, experienced in reading pack dynamics, felt the resistance. He pushed harder, his voice rising, his dominance radiating outward in waves of alpha authority that usually crushed any hint of opposition. It didn't work. The uncomfortable feeling persisted, spreading through the gathering like ripples on water. From her position at the very edge of the assembly, so far back she was almost in shadow, Sarah finally lifted her eyes. She looked directly at Cain for perhaps 3 seconds, her gaze neither challenging nor submissive, but simply present. Aware. Knowing. Then she lowered her eyes again and returned to her characteristic invisibility. Cain found himself stumbling over his words. The certainty he'd felt moments ago evaporated, replaced by doubt. Was this law really necessary? Was it perhaps too harsh? The thought was alien to him, unprecedented. He never doubted council decisions. "We will revisit this matter," he heard himself saying, shocked by his own words. Further consideration may be warranted. The assembly ended in confusion. Council members never backed down, never showed uncertainty. Yet Cain had done exactly that. Later, in the privacy of the council chambers, Mara confronted him. "What happened out there? You were prepared to push that law through regardless of resistance." Cain, still shaken, couldn't explain it. Something felt wrong. "I can't articulate it, but forcing that law in that moment felt like it would damage something important." "Damage what?" Lysandra pressed. "The hierarchy is absolute. Alpha will is not subject to pack sentiment." "I know that," Cain snapped, frustrated by his own inexplicable behavior. "I know the traditions. But wisdom sometimes requires flexibility." The other council members exchanged glances. Cain never spoke of flexibility. He was the most rigid traditionalist among them. What none of them realized was that the foundations of their authority were already cracked, weakened by months of Sarah's subtle influence. She hadn't challenged them openly, hadn't spoken a single word against them. She'd simply been present, a quiet constant, gradually shifting perspectives, soothing conflicts, demonstrating through actions rather than words that the council's rigid hierarchy was neither natural nor necessary. The tremors were growing stronger. The question was whether the council would recognize the earthquake coming before it was too late. The confrontation came on a spring evening when cherry blossoms drifted through the valley like pink snow and the air carried the promise of renewal. The council had called an emergency assembly, their patience finally exhausted. Over the preceding weeks, their authority had continued to erode in ways they could no longer ignore or rationalize. Direct orders were being gently reinterpreted rather than followed exactly. Punishments they decreed were somehow being softened without their explicit permission. Most troubling of all, pack members were looking to each other for guidance rather than automatically deferring to the council's wisdom. Demetrius had finally identified the common thread. "It's the Omega," he reported, his voice tight with anger at having missed it for so long. "Sarah. She's at the center of every anomaly, every deviation from proper order." "An Omega?" Lysandra's laugh was sharp with disbelief. "You're suggesting an Omega is somehow undermining the Alpha Council? The weakest wolf in the pack is challenging our authority." "I'm suggesting we investigate," Demetrius replied carefully. "The pattern is undeniable." Cain had authorized immediate action. Sarah was to be brought before the council and questioned. Depending on her answers, punishment might range from severe restriction to exile or even execution. The council's authority could not tolerate challenges, regardless of their source. Now, as twilight deepened into night, Sarah stood before the 5 alphas in the council's highest cave. Torvin had escorted her personally, expecting resistance or fear. He'd found neither. She'd simply accompanied him, her characteristic quietude unchanged. She stood before them now, small and unassuming, her gray-brown fur unremarkable, her posture neither cowering nor defiant. She simply existed, present and alert, waiting. Cain began the interrogation, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. You have been observed interfering in pack matters beyond your station. Explain yourself. Sarah's response was soft but clear. I have interfered with nothing, Prime Alpha. I have simply existed and, when possible, helped where help was needed. Helped. Mara's voice dripped with scorn. Omegas do not help. They serve. They obey. They know their place. I have done all those things, Sarah replied, still calm. I have served faithfully, obeyed every direct command, and known my place in the hierarchy you created. Then explain, Demetrius demanded. How is it that wherever you go, our authority weakens? How is it that wolves who should fear us instead question us? How is it that you, an Omega, seem to influence events without speaking, without challenging, without any visible exercise of power? For the first time in her life, Sarah smiled, a gentle expression that somehow illuminated the entire cave despite the failing light. Because, she said softly, you have always misunderstood what power is. The temperature in the cave seemed to drop. The 5 council members bristled, their dominance rising instinctively to crush this unprecedented challenge from the lowest of the low. Sarah remained unchanged, unaffected by the wave of alpha authority washing over her. Power, as you understand it, she continued, her voice never rising yet somehow filling the space, is force. Dominance. The ability to compel obedience through strength and fear. You believe yourselves powerful because wolves submit to you, because you can punish those who displease you, because your bloodlines and traditions have given you authority. That is power, Cain growled. Natural law itself proclaims it. Natural law, Sarah echoed, and now something began to shift in the cave. The air itself seemed to respond to her words, growing thick with potential. Let me show you what nature truly values. She closed her eyes. What happened next would be debated for generations, described in hushed tones around fires and passed down as the moment everything changed. The cave filled with light, not the harsh glare of flame, but a soft, pervasive luminescence that seemed to emanate from Sarah herself. It wasn't threatening or violent. It was warm, welcoming, like sunshine filtering through leaves or moonlight on water. But with the light came awareness. The council members found themselves experiencing something unprecedented. They felt what Sarah felt. Not through words or explanation, but through direct, undeniable emotional and mental connection. They experienced her awareness of the pack, not as a hierarchy to be managed, but as a living network of interconnected lives, each valuable, each contributing to the whole. They felt her understanding of every pack member, their fears, hopes, struggles, and potential. They experienced her awareness of the complex web of relationships that truly held the pack together, relationships that had nothing to do with the official hierarchy and everything to do with genuine connection, mutual support, and shared purpose. Through her perception, they saw themselves as the pack saw them, not as wise leaders, but as rigid enforcers of an outdated system that created unnecessary suffering. They felt the quiet resentment of wolves forced into roles that didn't suit them, the frustrated potential of those denied opportunities because of birth rank, the grinding exhaustion of those at the bottom of a hierarchy that valued them only for their utility. And they felt something else, something that shook them to their core. They felt Sarah's power. It wasn't the power of Fang and Claw. It was something far more fundamental. She could perceive the emotional and mental state of every wolf in the pack simultaneously. She could influence feelings without commanding, shift perspectives without speaking, heal not just bodies, but the psychological wounds that hierarchy inflicted. She could sense the pack's needs before they became crises, could guide conflicts toward resolution, could nurture potential that the Council's rigid system would have crushed. She was an empath of extraordinary magnitude, with abilities that transcended anything in the Council's experience or understanding. And she had been using these abilities, quietly and persistently, to heal and strengthen the pack despite the Council's harmful policies. Sarah's voice came as if from a great distance, though she stood only paces away, is what you dismissed as weakness. This is what you relegated to the lowest rank. The ability to understand, to connect, to heal, to guide without forcing. You have led through fear and strength, and you have created a pack that survives, but does not thrive, that functions, but does not flourish. The light intensified, and now they experienced something even more unsettling. They felt what the pack could become. Sarah showed them a vision of Crescent Valley where hierarchy was based not on birth, but on contribution and aptitude, where strength was valued, but so was wisdom, empathy, creativity, and cooperation. They saw a pack where wolves flourished rather than merely survived, where potential was nurtured regardless of bloodline, where leadership emerged from genuine capability rather than inherited position. It was beautiful, terrifying in its difference from everything they knew, but undeniably beautiful. Slowly, the light faded. Sarah opened her eyes, and the connection dissolved, leaving the council members gasping as if they'd been underwater and had suddenly broken the surface. "That is my power," Sarah said quietly. "That is what you never saw, never valued, never imagined could exist. And that is what has been quietly reshaping this pack around you, not in opposition to you, but in spite of you." Kane found his voice first, though it came out shaken, lacking its usual absolute certainty. What are you?" "I am what I have always been," Sarah replied. "An Omega by your classification, but in truth, I am simply a wolf who sees connections where you see only hierarchy, who values healing where you value strength, who believes in the potential of every pack member rather than the superiority of a chosen few." "This is impossible," Lysandra whispered, her entire understanding of the world crumbling around her. "Omegas are weak. That is natural law. That is how it has always been." "No," Sarah corrected gently. "That is how you have always chosen to see it. But your choice does not determine nature's truth. There are many kinds of strength, many forms of leadership, many ways to serve the pack's well-being. You chose to value only one and built your entire society around that choice. But nature is more complex, more varied, and more wonderful than your rigid categories allow." The silence that followed was profound. The Alpha Council, for the first time in living memory, had no response. They had been challenged in a way they'd never imagined possible, by a power they'd never known existed, wielded by a wolf they'd considered beneath their notice. And the most devastating part was that they couldn't simply crush this challenge with force. What could dominance displays and physical strength do against a power that operated on an entirely different plane of existence? The weeks following the revelation were chaotic, confusing, and ultimately transformative. The Alpha Council, faced with undeniable evidence that their understanding of power and hierarchy was incomplete, found themselves in unprecedented territory. Kane's first instinct had been to exile Sarah, to remove the threat she represented to their traditional order. But when he'd attempted to issue that command, he discovered something disturbing. The pack wouldn't follow it. Not in open rebellion, no one challenged his authority directly, but through 100 small refusals, gentle redirections, and quiet acts of protection, the pack made clear that Sarah would not be exiled. It was Mara who first articulated the impossible situation they faced. "We've lost our authority," she said during a private council meeting, her voice hollow with shock. "Not through force, not through formal challenge, but through obsolescence. The pack no longer needs us the way they once did." "Because she's been doing our job better than we have," Torvin added, the admission clearly painful. "All these months, she's been managing conflicts, maintaining well-being, strengthening the pack. And she's done it without authority, without formal power, without any of the tools we've always believed were necessary for leadership." Demetrius, whose entire role had been predicated on information control and strategic manipulation, laughed bitterly. "She made us irrelevant. Not by fighting us, but by quietly demonstrating that everything we believed about leadership was wrong." Lysandra, keeper of traditions, looked oldest in that moment, her certainty, the foundation of her identity, shattered. "What do we do? How do we lead when everything we know is proven false?" It was a question none of them could answer. So they did something the Alpha Council had never done before. They asked for guidance. From Sarah. She met with them not in their high cave. That symbolism, she gently suggested, was part of the problem, but in a common space, on level ground. The council members found the experience profoundly unsettling. Without the physical elevation, without the trappings of their authority surrounding them, they felt exposed, vulnerable. "Tell us," Cain asked, and his voice carried none of its usual command, only genuine uncertainty. "What should we do now? How should the pack be led?" Sarah regarded them with that steady, knowing gaze that no longer seemed quiet submission, but rather deep perception. "The question itself reveals the problem," she said. "You ask what you should do, as if leadership is something imposed from above. But true leadership emerges from service, from understanding, from connection to those you lead." "That sounds lovely in theory," Mara replied, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice, "but packs need structure. They need order. Without hierarchy, we'd have chaos." "I'm not suggesting we eliminate structure," Sarah clarified. "I'm suggesting we restructure based on different principles. Not birth and dominance, but aptitude and contribution. Not rigid hierarchy, but flexible roles that allow wolves to serve where they're best suited." She paused, letting them absorb this. "You five are not leaders because you're alphas. You became alphas because you were born to alpha bloodlines. But Cain, you're actually a skilled strategist when you're not constrained by tradition. Mara, you have genuine organizational talent. Torvin's combat expertise is valuable. Demetrius understands pack dynamics. Lysandra has knowledge worth preserving. These skills have value. But they shouldn't be the only skills valued, and they shouldn't automatically grant you absolute authority over those with different strengths." "So we should what?" Demetrius asked. "Simply abandon leadership?" "No," Sarah replied patiently. "You should lead differently. Form a council not of alphas who rule by birth, but of wolves with varied skills who serve by contributing their strengths. Include those with abilities you've overlooked. The healer who saves lives. The teacher who nurtures young minds. The mediator who resolves conflicts. The innovator who finds better ways. And yes, the empath who maintains emotional well-being." She held their gazes steadily. "Leadership is not about standing above others. It's about standing among them, seeing clearly what they need, and using your unique abilities to help provide it. Power is not the ability to force obedience. It's the ability to inspire cooperation, to nurture potential, to create conditions where everyone can flourish. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Traditions 3 generations deep couldn't be dismantled and rebuilt in days or even weeks. But it began. The Alpha Council, now calling themselves simply the Council, reorganized. They remained, but with redefined roles and reduced authority. They became facilitators rather than dictators, coordinators rather than commanders. Other wolves were invited to join them, creating a larger, more diverse leadership body. Rowan the Healer joined. Cashin, a mid-rank wolf with innovative ideas about hunting and territory management, was welcomed. Elena, an Omega who'd proven brilliant at teaching pups, was given a voice. And Sarah, of course, became the council's heart, not its head, she insisted, but the constant reminder of why they existed and whom they served. The rigid hierarchy began to soften. Wolves were evaluated not by birth rank, but by their contributions and capabilities. An Omega with talent could rise. An Alpha without aptitude could find themselves serving rather than leading. The change was uncomfortable for many, particularly those who'd benefited from the old system, but it was also undeniably better. The pack's well-being improved dramatically. With wolves in roles that suited their actual abilities, efficiency increased. With reduced emphasis on dominance and submission, stress decreased. Conflicts were resolved through mediation rather than force. Resources were distributed based on need rather than rank. Most remarkably, the pack discovered talents they'd never known existed. Omegas who'd been relegated to menial labor revealed artistic, intellectual, and strategic abilities that had simply been suppressed. Mid-ranks who'd been stuck in unsuitable roles found their true callings. Even some alphas, freed from the burden of pretending omniscient authority, discovered they were happier and more effective in specialized roles than they'd ever been as generalist rulers. Kane, in a private moment with Sarah months after the transformation began, made a striking admission. I was taught my entire life that I was superior, that my bloodline made me inherently better and more capable than others. Believing that was both a burden and a comfort. The burden of living up to impossible expectations, the comfort of never having to question my right to rule. He paused, watching the pack interact in the communal space below their vantage point. What you showed us was that superiority is a lie. We're not better. We're just different. And our differences only have value when they serve something larger than ourselves. Sarah nodded. That's wisdom, Kane. The kind that can't be inherited or commanded into existence. The kind that has to be learned through humility and honest reflection. I hated you for a while, Kane admitted. For destroying my certainty, for revealing my inadequacy, for making me question everything I'd been taught. I know, Sarah said gently. Change is painful, especially when it reveals that what we believed was wrong. But growth requires that pain. The alternative is stagnation and eventual collapse. By the time Winter returned to Crescent Valley, the transformation was largely complete. The pack that gathered for the winter solstice celebration bore little resemblance to the one that had existed a year prior. There was still structure, communities need organization to function, but it was fluid rather than rigid, earned rather than inherited, based on service rather than dominance. There were still leaders, but they led through competence and consent rather than birthright and fear. And there was Sarah, no longer forced into invisibility, no longer pretending that silence meant submission. She moved through the pack openly now, her abilities recognized and valued, her quiet strength acknowledged as exactly that, strength, different from but equal to any other form. The story of the Silent Omega spread beyond Crescent Valley. Other packs heard of the transformation and sent observers, skeptics who came to mock and stayed to learn. Some returned to their own territories and began similar changes. Others rejected the new ways as dangerous deviation from natural law. But in Crescent Valley itself, the pack thrived in ways they never had under the Alpha Council's reign. They were stronger not because of hierarchy, but despite its absence. More capable because they valued all forms of contribution. More resilient because they'd learned that diversity of thought and ability was an asset, not a weakness. On a spring evening, as cherry blossoms once again drifted through the valley, the council gathered for their regular meeting. 12 wolves now sat in a circle, no head, no elevated positions, just equals contributing their varied strengths to the collective good. Sarah, participating fully, smiled as she listened to the discussion. They were debating the best approach to integrating a group of lone wolves who'd requested admission to the pack, a discussion that involved perspectives from the healer, health screening, the teacher, cultural integration, the strategist, territorial impact, and yes, the empath, emotional compatibility. It was messy. Democracy and diverse perspectives always were. It took longer to reach decisions when you couldn't simply command obedience. It was harder to lead when you had to persuade rather than dominate. But it was also beautiful, rich with possibility, alive in a way that the old hierarchy never was. As the meeting concluded and wolves dispersed to their various responsibilities, Cain approached Sarah. "You changed everything," he said, and it was not an accusation, but an acknowledgement. "You took a system that had lasted generations and dismantled it." "No," Sarah corrected gently. "I revealed that it was already broken. I simply offered an alternative. The pack chose to change. That choice was theirs, not mine." "But you made the choice possible," Cain insisted. "Your power, your vision, your patience in working toward this moment for months before revealing yourself. Without you, we'd still be ruling the old way, convinced of our righteousness, blind to our failures." Sarah considered this. Perhaps. Or perhaps some other catalyst would have emerged. Change comes when it's needed, Cain. I was simply the form it took in this place, at this time. She paused, her gaze drifting across the valley where pack members went about their lives fuller and freer than they'd been a year ago. The real question is what happens next. We've torn down an old system and built something new. But new systems can become rigid too. New truths can become dogma. The challenge now is to remain flexible, to keep questioning, to never again become so certain of our rightness that we can't see our wrongs. Cain nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in her words. The revolution wasn't finished. It would never be finished. The work of creating a just, functional, thriving community was ongoing, requiring constant attention, regular reassessment, and the humility to keep changing when change was needed. "Will you stay?" he asked. "Will you continue to serve on the council, to guide us with your abilities?" "For now," Sarah replied. "But my hope is that eventually you won't need me. That the principles we've established will become integrated into how the pack thinks and operates. That empathy and connection will be valued not because I'm here to demonstrate them, but because the pack has learned their worth for themselves." She smiled. That's the real measure of lasting change. Not whether one powerful individual can impose a better system, but whether the community can internalize better principles and maintain them even after that individual is gone. As night fell over Crescent Valley, Sarah stood at the edge of the communal space and let her awareness expand, touching lightly on the emotional state of every pack member. There was still conflict, still struggle, still pain. Those were inevitable parts of life. But there was also hope, possibility, genuine joy in ways there hadn't been under the old regime. The Silent Omega had spoken, not with words, but with actions, not with commands, but with demonstrations of a better way. She had challenged the Alpha Council not through force, but through the irrefutable evidence of her competence and care. And in doing so, she had written a new story for Crescent Valley, one that future generations would tell as the moment when they learned that true power lies not in dominance, but in service, not in hierarchy, but in harmony, not in forcing submission, but in earning cooperation. The revolution of the Silent Omega was complete. The ongoing work of building something better had just begun. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all, that challenging outdated systems is only the first step. The harder, longer, more important work is creating and maintaining better ones, remaining always vigilant against the human or wolf tendency to calcify good ideas into rigid dogma. In 2026, as the human world grappled with its own questions about leadership, authority, and who deserves power, the wolves of Crescent Valley offered a timeless answer: those who serve with wisdom, empathy, and genuine commitment to the collective good. Not because of birth or force, but because they've earned trust through demonstrated care. The Silent Omega's secret was this: that the most powerful force in any community is not the ability to command, but the ability to connect, to understand, to heal, and to inspire others toward their best selves. And that secret, once revealed, changed everything.